Hey everybody, welcome back to theclinicaltrialsguru.com. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure that you subscribe on YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, the blog itself. You don't want to miss out my giveaways that I'm going to be doing. So, I had a lot of topics I wanted to discuss, and I thought about doing one long video, but I think I'm going to break them up into shorter videos. So one of them is not getting enough studies or enough patients for your studies is your fault. Okay, I'm not going to do that one today, but I feel really passionately about that one. So I want to spend some more time on that because today I've got to run. I want to do one about coordinator performance reviews, so thank you to the person that asked me that question. But today I'm going to focus on satellite sites versus having separate sites and what the benefits are, kind of the pros and cons. So a lot of my sites, a lot of my clients, a lot of the sites I'm involved with, they follow my advice, so they're getting lots of doctors, and they're getting lots of doctors interested in research and lots of doctors interested as being sub-Is, PIs. The doctors see research as a good secondary source of income. So there comes a point where you have so many different doctors and so many different offices in your region that it'd be very easy for you to actually do the study at two different sites. So instead of just having one site, your main site where you're doing the studies from, you can also use one of your doctors who's really excited about research and use his or her own office as your second site. Now you have two choices here. Do you negotiate one contract and do regulatory docs one time and have one site with two satellite sites? So that first option is called a satellite site. So your main office is where a lot of the procedures are going to be done, but also some of the procedures are going to be done at the satellite site. Some sites choose this because it's simpler. So if you enroll one patient at one site, and then you enroll another one at the other site, that patient, if that's a satellite site, at the second site becomes patient number 2. As opposed to if that second site was a separate site in and of itself, that would actually be subject number 1. So some sites prefer that. The issue then becomes where is the IP stored, and some protocols the IP is blinded, so it's actually randomly assigned, so that brings up the issue of having to go back and forth to transport the IP from one site to another, because you can't possibly know which IP is going to be randomly assigned at each site, so you can't have that batch over there. So that's one reason why sites may not want to do this, is because it brings up the issue of transporting IP back and forth. So what I propose, and it's actually better financially for the sites as well, is negotiate two contracts. So you're essentially having two sites under the same company name. So if my clinical trial company name is the Clinical Trials Guru, and I have a site here and a site 30 miles away, they're both of those sites are under the Clinical Trials Guru company. So, but each one has a different PI. Okay, so that's actually having two separate sites. Under the satellite site model that I just got finished describing, you're really only going to have one PI. That was an important thing I left out. You're only going to have one PI, but you might have sub-Is. Okay, so the one at the other site might be a sub-I, but there can only be one PI. That's a satellite site. If you have two PIs, technically you need two contracts, two sets of reg docs, because you need two separate 1572s and all that other stuff, and then you can have two sites. The benefit of doing that is each PI has a little more of an incentive, because let's face it, we can create all the incentives we want for sub-Is, but sub-Is are only going to do so much. But if they're PI, okay, now they have even more incentive to do a good job recruiting, enrolling. Not to mention you can negotiate two separate advance payments for each contract, and you can tell the sponsor, we're going to save you time because we're only going to negotiate the contract one time, and we're going to use the contract and budget for each site. So we're only going to go through this negotiating process one time, and we're going to use the same budget at both sites, but they're going to technically have different contracts, different budgets, whole separate set of reg docs, and everything else. And you can still share staff. Like the coordinator can be on the delegation log at both sites. The PIs of each site can still be sub-Is on each other's sites. So I like option 2 for many reasons. It's simpler, it's easier, you don't need to worry about transporting IP. You give the PIs more incentive because now you have 2 PIs. It builds up the PIs' resumes quicker because they're PIs instead of sub-Is. 2 advances, okay? And at the end of the day, probably you're making more money. So that's why I recommend doing this. I like having 2 separate sites under the same company. Oh, and payments can still be mailed to one address. Okay, they can mail the payments to the company headquarters. So I like option 2. Many sites still like option 1. Whatever floats your boat, but that's how I roll. This is Dan from theclinicaltrialsguru.com, and keep your questions coming. Thanks.